President and First Lady McGroder, fellows, families, and guests. It really is a huge honor and a humbling experience to be the Dean of the Academy. I counted, and I've attended 11 Dean's addresses since I became a fellow. They were all great speeches. And after being named Dean last April, I read about 15 other addresses, trying to figure out what I should talk about today. It was pretty intimidating for the son of a bread salesman. In 1945, my father returned from World War II, part of the greatest generation that defeated fascism, and then reshaped the last half of the 20th century. Dad firmly believed that education and competition were the keys to success in life. And with only a 10th grade formal education himself, it's pretty safe to say that the day I graduated from law school was the proudest day of his life, the third of his 3 kids to earn a college degree, and the first and only lawyer in the family. My dad loved to sit for hours at the kitchen table and argue with me about world affairs. Obviously, his view of the world was shaped by his service in the 5th Medical Battalion of Patton's 3rd Army. And that, in turn, helped to shape my worldview. Of course, this is like millions of other American stories, but still I marvel, and I am incredibly grateful that the son of a bread salesman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, can become the Dean of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. The subject of my Dean's address today is the role of trial advocacy in what the late Canadian scholar Marshall McLuhan famously called the global village, which he predicted in the 1970s would be built on an electronic nervous system, or what we now know as the Internet. First, because I appreciate the incredibly good fortune that made this possible, I want to look back at some of the people and events instrumental in bringing me here. Second, I'll take a look at the current state of dispute resolution systems and the rule of law in the world today, focusing primarily upon the impact of information technology. And then finally, I'm going to attempt to explore what I see as the future of trial advocacy in this 21st century global village. Now, I'm fairly sure that future is likely to challenge many of the values that we hold most dear. It'll probably cause some discomfort and, I suspect, some disagreement, but I'm optimistic. And I hope that when I finish, you'll all be optimistic as well. You might recognize that face. In the spring of 1973, Lee Kreindler delivered his Dean's address. And no, I had no idea what was going to precede me this morning. In reading it, it was brilliant and it was bold. And reading it shortly after I became Dean provided much of the inspiration for this address. Lee reported about his service with the words that are up on the screen. As many of you know, I undertook the responsibilities of Dean with a particular subject in mind, the role of lawyers and the Academy itself in working toward world peace through law, and more particularly in the expansion of jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. That is staggeringly audacious. To think that the International Court of Justice might become a forum to promote world peace by enforcing the rights of individuals, and that the fellows of this academy might play a significant role in causing that to happen, was pretty much the trial lawyer equivalent of Kevin Costner's character in The Field of Dreams believing that voice that told him, if you build it, he will come. At about the time Lee was delivering his Dean's address, I was a junior at the Defiance College in Defiance, Ohio. I had finally accepted that I was never going to make it to the show. I wasn't going to be a catcher in the major leagues. So I shifted to intercollegiate speech and debate. I had the great good fortune that a professor by the name of Jan Younger pulled me from an introductory course in persuasion and taught me and all the others on his national championship teams how to put together a prima facie case, how to use evidence in the construction or the destruction of an argument, and what Aristotle meant when he said an advocate should use all of the available means of persuasion. In Greek terms, ethos, pathos, and logos, roughly translated as virtue, emotion, and logic. Coach Younger sent us forth from a small liberal arts college in rural northwest Ohio with a lasting commitment to the value of competition and the adversarial process in the pursuit of truth and academic and intellectual excellence. Coach Younger was the second best thing that happened to me at Defiance College. As most of you know, meeting Joanne was the best. Most of you also know we were married, moved to Miami in 1974, and I attended law school at the University of Miami and entered the private practice of law thereafter. For most of my 35 years, I've been a professional schizophrenic, moving between the U.S. trial bar on the one hand and the world of domestic and now later international arbitration on the other. I am incredibly blessed to be part of a law firm created by Bill Colson and Bill Hicks. Both were fellows of this academy, and Bill Hicks was the president in 1986. Colson Hicks Idson has been privileged to represent some of the most wonderful clients, handled some of the most fascinating cases, and enjoyed some of the greatest successes any trial law firm could ever imagine. In the process, we learned the skills of the trial advocate that were largely unique to the United States in the last half of the 20th century. We learned Irving Younger's 10 Commandments of cross-examination. Of course, we grew up with Bill Colson's instant final argument. And most important, without a doubt, we were given the enormous privilege to become colleagues and learn from such fantastic trial lawyers as all of you and the fellows of the other great trial bar organizations. Never once, not once, have I taken for granted the incredible opportunities afforded me by my past and present partners, and the camaraderie of the trial bar, particularly this organization, this academy, is just simply unparalleled. We also learn from jury consultants and other professionals such things as the value of presenting logical arguments and evidence to so-called left-brain jurors and emotional arguments and evidence to right-brain jurors. We're just now beginning to use the neurological sciences to understand the decision-making process. From a group of actors, we learned the skills of the theater, such as voice projection and inflection, facial and body expressions. And I learned about the 10-word telegram, where I came to understand the power of eye contact and simple, compelling language as persuasive tools. Happy to share that with any of you sometime over a drink. And we've all learned firsthand that an independent judiciary, populated by independent judges and well-trained advocates, not beholden to the government or powerful private interests, is essential to a liberal democracy where justice is truly made available to all. In the process, we were also privileged to earn a very good living. But before I joined Colson Hicks Idson, I started out as a construction lawyer. I learned about the history and role of, in the United States at least, arbitration as an alternative to the civil justice system, mostly for the construction industry. We young lawyers in the construction bar volunteered to serve as arbitrators. We weren't compensated. It was part of our tutelage back in the 1970s and 80s. At that time, I really knew nothing at all about the role arbitration had come to play in the resolution of disputes between people from different countries. I learned that only after I actually become a fellow of this academy, traveled the world with many of you, and made some crazy decisions, like teaching at the National University of Mongolia. Yes, it's true. I've learned a lot about civil justice systems around the world in the past few years, but mostly I've actually learned that the importance of arbitration is the preferred dispute resolution method for civil disputes among people from different nations. Which brings me to the second part of this speech today. Even before Lee Kreindler was dreaming about the International Court of Justice as a world court for enforcement of individual rights, this gentleman, other lawyers, including this Peter Sanders, were imagining international arbitration systems. Those lawyers were every bit as audacious as Lee, and as we now learned, Ambassador Clark. And they were remarkably successful. They built the foundations of the present systems of international commercial and international investment arbitration. Professor Saunders, who died just last year at the age of 100, is widely credited as the father of the 1958 New York Convention on Recognition of Arbitration Agreements and Enforcement of Arbitration Awards. We heard about the efforts to adopt the Montreal Convention this morning. More than 145 nations have committed their courts to compel agreements to arbitrate and to enforce arbitration awards, whatever their nation of origin. So just to provide a little perspective, the judgment of a U.S. court is basically enforceable in the courts of the United States. On the other hand, because of the success of the New York Convention, an arbitration award entered in any country is enforceable in the courts of 145 other countries, including every court in every state in the United States. Not long after the New York Convention, the Washington Convention of 1965 created an arbitral forum housed in the World Bank in Washington, where claims can be brought against governments for expropriation without compensation or other unfair or discriminatory treatment of investments by foreign nationals. Sovereign governments today are often ordered by three-person arbitral tribunals to pay compensation to private citizens and corporations for violations of these treaty commitments. Hopefully, at least I hope, someday these treaty arbitrations will include claims on behalf of less conventional investors, like, for example, an international trade union that invests in developing nations to protect the rights of workers there. For now, they're only in existence to protect property rights and investments. These international arbitration systems are under constant and undoubtedly sometimes legitimate attack. But neither is in serious danger of extinction. In fact, in his State of the Union address just this past year, January, President Obama announced that negotiations between the United States and the European Union toward the adoption of a multilateral investment treaty like NAFTA between Canada and Mexico are nearing completion. If adopted, it will almost certainly include investment treaty arbitration for resolution of investment disputes, and there will be many. It's lawyers who conceived and created these systems, but for the most part, they were not trial lawyers. Today, thousands of lawyers serve as advocates, arbitrators, and managers of international arbitration forums. But for the most part, they're not trial lawyers. For the past 20 years, thousands of lawyers have traveled to Vienna in March. They just completed it this past March, and donated their time as part of the Willem C. Viz. International Commercial Arbitration Moot to train law students in the advocacy skills of international arbitration. In 2012, the Viz Moot hosted 285 teams from 71 countries and hundreds of lawyers to teach and to serve as arbitrators in the moot. But for the most part, they're not trial lawyers. In my view, it's long past time for trial lawyers to actually heed Lee Kreindler's guidance and enter that world, contributing our enormous time, talent, and treasure to the advocacy and to the dispute resolution that takes place in these arbitration systems. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting for one moment that we abandon our jury trial system or the other independent judiciaries of the liberal democratic governments. No, they're critical components of liberal democracies and the rule of law. I'm merely observing that arbitration is by far the predominant method of dispute resolution for civil and commercial disputes in the international realm, and that these arbitral systems would benefit from greater participation by the best and the brightest of the trial bar, particularly the fellows of this academy. Now, What could possibly have convinced me to include such sacrilege in the Dean's address to the best trial lawyers in the world, when I know many of you, including me and several of my partners, have fought against arbitration imposed in the U.S. consumer and the U.S. employment context for years? It is because I fear that that battle is lost. I've spent huge amounts of time the past few years working with the South Florida Maritime Bar, including some of my partners, trying to first to avoid and then trying to make sure that the arbitration provisions the cruise industry now includes in all contracts of employment with seafarers from around the world, to avoid South Florida juries, so that at least they provide a reasonably fair and forum and accessible forum for the resolution of disputes under the Jones Act to protect injured seafarers. I don't have a clue whether we'll succeed, but there really isn't any choice right now, unless we're going to abandon these decent, hardworking people when they're injured in service to the cruise industry. It's this experience, and many others, and my observation of two enormous trends during the last quarter of the 20th century that convinced me to include this call to action today. In the first of the great trends, the Supreme Court of the United States has transformed the United States Federal Arbitration Act into a class action reform and a tort reform tool far more effective than Congress or any of the state legislatures have ever managed to accomplish. Whatever one's view of the Supreme Court's decisions, and I suspect I know the views of almost everyone in here, and I share them, there's simply no denying the impact that they have on the U.S. trial bar. Claims our clients once pursued or defended only before judges or juries, individually or as class claims, are now maintainable, if at all, only in arbitration. But I'm going to shift gears because the second trend, Windows 95, the Intel processor, and the Internet ushered in the information technology revolution. It really and truly did change things for trial lawyers, arbitration practitioners alike, and frankly, of course, the entire world. You may recognize this face. In his 2001 Dean's Address, Jim Bostwick talked about some of the changes and the fears the information technology revolution engendered among lawyers, particularly trial lawyers. He said, "The postmodern world is intrinsically tied to the universal use of the digital computer. Whether one is morphing illustrations for use in court, researching complex medical issues, or sending rocket probes into space. All of this involves instantaneous communication and information retrieval among people everywhere. The world has shrink-wrapped in an electronic membrane. Only a click separates us from people across the globe. This communication revolution is fast rendering national borders and other geographic notions obsolete." Here it is. The Academy has responsibilities that are not just local, but that are international in scope. Well, Jim was right, of course, but and I'm sure he would agree today, that he really only touched on the extent of the transformation. To really, truly understand its impact, I think it might help us to look at the world of education. One of the most fascinating people in education today is a man named Sir Kenneth Robinson. Sir Ken is the former Director of Arts Education at the University of Warwick, and he's now an internationally known advisor on education in the arts. If you follow the TED conferences, you may have seen some of his presentations. He is truly a TED rock star. I'm going to share a segment from one of those presentations in a moment, and to highlight its relevance, I want to focus on one aspect of his lecture that he called Bring On the Learning Revolution. Sir Ken says that the generational divide created by the information technology revolution is the greatest generational divide in the history of mankind. He is not just talking about long hair, loud music, and tattoos. Entire relationships are nurtured and established over the internet by people under the age of 25 who've never known a world without the World Wide Web. We may all think the Manti Te'o story was an obvious hoax, because nobody could fall in love with someone he'd never met in person. Well, our children and our grandchildren don't find that hard to understand at all. Just watch the Catfish MTV series, and you'll see that it's actually an increasingly common form of hoax in the 21st century. So Sir Ken's message is that if we hope to bridge this massive generational gap, we must identify and then we must disenthrall ourselves from ideas that were formed to meet the circumstances of the prior century. And in the following section, he turns to a quotation from our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, to make the point.
Innovation is hard because it means doing something that people don't find very easy for the most part. It means challenging what we take for granted, things that we think are obvious. The great problem for reform or transformation is the tyranny of common sense. Things that people think, well, they can't be done any other way because that's the way it's done. I came across a great quote recently from Abraham Lincoln, who I thought you'd be pleased to have quoted at this point. He said this in December 1862 to the second annual meeting of Congress. I ought to explain that I have no idea what was happening at the time. We don't teach American history in Britain. We suppress it. You know, this is our policy, so no doubt something fascinating was happening in December 1862, which the Americans among us will be aware of. But he said this: the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. I love that. Not rise to it, rise with it. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. I love that word, disenthrall. You know what he means? That there are ideas that all of us are enthralled to, which we simply take for granted as the natural order of things, the way things are. And many of our ideas have been formed not to meet the circumstances of this century, but to cope with the circumstances of previous centuries. But our minds are still hypnotized by them. And we have to disenthrall ourselves of some of them. Now, doing this is easier said than done. It's very hard to know, by the way, what it is you take for granted. And the reason is that you take it for granted.
So, as Sir Ken might ask, what is it that we trial lawyers born and raised in the 20th century are taking for granted about trial advocacy of the 21st century that we don't know we're taking for granted? Well, I've got a suggestion. Many of us in this room, and I'm sure if I looked I could pick out some of you that I attended with, will remember that about 20 years ago, nearly every trial lawyer conference included at least one speaker who was going to tell us how to deal with the Generation X juror. Remember that? How can we construct our arguments and how do we present evidence to win over jurors who grew up with the instant gratification of television legal series like LA Law? We thought we were pretty avant-garde, didn't we? How lame is that? Television? You got to be kidding me. Are we still trying to solve that problem today when most young adults are more comfortable communicating on Facebook, Skype, and Twitter than they are carrying on a human conversation? Television? Television is fighting just to stay relevant among the youth, and it is losing that fight miserably. So, as we acknowledge the jury's trial has become increasingly more rare, doesn't it seem a little less essential that we adapt our skills of advocacy to communicate with those fewer and fewer young people who are summoned to serve as jurors in our courtrooms or who will soon be our judges? And much more essential, that we adapt our skills of advocacy to communicate with the millions of younger people who live large parts of their lives in cyberspace. Because that's where many of the serious and important decisions and much of the important advocacy will take place in the 21st century. I'm going to talk a little more about that shortly, but please bear with me. I need to pause briefly to make some observations about the rule of law in a way that we here don't discuss it very often. And again, it's because, as Sir Ken says, it really is hard to know what we're taking for granted. In late November of last year, the World Justice Project, an independent nonprofit created at the initiative of Bill Newcomb, partner of one of our fellows, former general counsel to Microsoft and later president of the American Bar Association, released its Rule of Law Index for 2012. And the Rule of Law Index covers 97 countries, representing over 90% of the world's population. This index is organized around 9 concepts. 1 is limited governments, powers. 2 is the absence of corruption. 3 is order and security. 4, fundamental rights. 5, open government. 6, regulatory enforcement. 7, which is the one we're most interested in, civil justice. 8, criminal justice. I should say I'm most interested in my speech today, sorry. 8, criminal justice, and 9, what they refer to as informal justice. Now, the index scores and rankings are drawn from a general population poll, I'm not making this number up, of 97,000 lay people around the world and 2,500 legal experts from around the world. Now, the outcome of this exercise is the world's most comprehensive measure of the extent to which countries are actually adhering to the rule of law. Not in theory, but in practice. So, how'd we do? The United States ranks 22nd among 97 nations covered in the category of civil justice. That's what most of us in this room do for a living. 22 out of 97. That's pretty sobering. Canada and the UK were 13th and 11th, respectively. Not bad, certainly better than us, but not great either. One of the most provocative legal thinkers today is a man named Jan Paulsen. He's the author of a book entitled Denial of Justice. And like the World Justice Project, he's gathered a great deal of evidence that many court systems around the world simply do not work. He's now a professor at the University of Miami School of Law, my alma mater. In a speech he first delivered in 2007, Professor Paulsen declared, "States all over the world unhesitatingly subscribe to numerous conventions and declarations reflecting near universal consensus to the effect of forbidding such things as slavery, discrimination against women, child labor, or persecution based on religion or race. This vision is an illusion. Worse, it's a fraud. To refer to it as an unrealistic idealism would be to let ourselves off too easily. In effect, claiming for ourselves good intentions. The fact is that we may be participating, at least negligently, and perhaps complicitly, in what I'm tempted to call the fraudulent consensus on the rule of law." Paulsen suggests that instead of encouraging developing nations to adopt beautiful constitutions and conventions, it might be better to assume a world where nothing is enforceable and where property and individual rights are totally insecure. And then look instead for what he calls enclaves of justice, modest examples, where some aspect of the rule of law is flourishing, and then try to replicate them. Paulsen shares a few examples that I'd like to share with you. Singapore. Singapore has lifted itself from poverty, and it has shed one of the most corrupt judicial systems in the world, becoming literally in one generation a nation with perhaps the most respected judiciary on earth today, primarily by recruiting judges on merit and paying them extraordinarily well. Singapore's courts are an enclave of justice. Paulson also refers to Mongolia, my favorite. Mongolia has instituted a whole lot of reforms since 1991 when the Soviet Empire dissolved. But the simplest and the most effective of them all, and believe it or not, it is this simple, is the establishment of an accurate and a transparent docket of cases. Transparency of the docket in Mongolia is an enclave of justice. Not surprisingly, since Paulson is a world-renowned expert in international arbitration, he says that investment treaty arbitration is forcing countries to improve their domestic civil justice systems in response to claims that are being brought against them under these treaties. He believes that treaty arbitration is an enclave of justice. I firmly believe that our China program and our Ireland program are wonderful examples. Neither one seeks to export our civil justice system. Rather, we seek to establish enduring relationships among our fellows and the delegates from these countries. Through these relationships, we believe that our programs advance the rule of law in modest, but in very long-lasting ways. In my view, the China program and the Ireland program are definitely enclaves of justice. Some of you know I have a dream myself for another IATL program. I'd like to see one young Pakistani lawyer and one young Indian lawyer come to live with fellows of the academy in the same city, so that these families and these fellows can engage them in their own lives and jointly with each other. It's my dream that an IATL India-Pakistan program might someday be an enclave of justice. So, if the 21st century global village is going to be populated mainly with these enclaves of justice, connected primarily by an electronic tether, well, what is the role for the trial advocate? I am sorry it took me so long to get here, but please, this is the heart of my speech, so stick with me for just a little while longer. As the 21st century moves from adolescence to youth, I truly believe that trial lawyers like us can continue to play an extremely important role in resolving disputes. But we can do this only if we decide to participate in transnational dispute resolution as it exists in reality. And that reality is defined more today and is likely in the future to be defined more by arbitration and by information technology than it is by the civil justice systems we've called home for many years. Some of us who've served on both the Admissions Committee and the International Relations Committee have quietly wondered to ourselves whether the phrase international trial lawyer isn't really something of a misnomer. I'm not familiar with any international jury trials. So, is there really such a thing as an international trial lawyer? And if so, what does this person look like? And where does she practice her profession? Does she speak only English, or must she be multilingual? If so, what other languages than English must she speak? Where was she educated? And does she have to have a license? If so, who has the authority to grant that license? And what are the professional rules applicable to her service as an international trial lawyer? Does she practice before national courts or courts like the International Court of Justice and the International Court of Criminal Justice that are really something of a mixture or a hybrid of what we consider to be courts and arbitral tribunals? Does she appear before private arbitral tribunals? In fact, does she ever even need to appear physically? Or will she be able to practice her entire career in the virtual world created by the internet and other technologies that provide the digital backbone for the global village, where video links and simultaneous language translation will soon be ubiquitous? Interesting questions? I hope so, but how are we going to find the answers today? Well, one of the foremost experts today on transnational regulation of the legal profession is the immediate past dean of the George Washington University Law School, and his name is Paul Schiff Berman. He points out that legal historians have studied the British colonial period as one of the best examples where multiple legal regimes occupied the same social field for a very sustained period of time. A period, of course, that turned out to be the first phase of the current globalization of the world economy. So I decided to take a look at the organization of advocates during the years of the British Empire to see what, if anything, it might tell us about how to organize advocates in the 21st century. I learned, along with many of you, that the International Council of Advocates and Barristers, called ICAB, is the umbrella organization of barristers and advocates from the UK and from many other former colonies that's been organized to promote and preserve those ancient principles most essential to the independent trial bar as it is developed before and during the centuries of Britain's colonial rule. The principles of ICAB that it promotes are not surprising at all. They include a commitment to the skills of advocacy, careful training through mentoring and tutelage to develop those skills, a fierce commitment to independence through organizational structures such as law libraries, chambers, and bar councils, and ethical principles that distinguish them a great deal from us in the U.S., that emphasize the obligation to the civil justice system itself, in other words, to the courts, over the obligation to separate clients. They're very proud of their commitment to the cab rank rule, which compels them, without fear or favor, to represent parties, regardless of how unpopular they may be in the community outside of the justice system. But what is the civil justice system in a 21st century global village? What will the great global legal organizations of the 21st century adopt as our core principles? Well, for thousands of years, philosophers have tried to define justice, and I certainly am not going to try to do that today. I'd put you all to sleep. But just to prove that you truly can find almost anything on the internet, and that not everything you find is worthless, even if it is a little whimsical, I want to share with you a short YouTube animation prepared by a delightful young professor at Northern Illinois University by the name of Dr. Ronaldo Tai. He tries to answer the question, what has justice meant in different historical times?
Let's talk about the history of the concept of justice. Justice meant something different in the ancient, medieval, modern, and postmodern texts.
Confucius talked about the love of humanity, not doing to others what we don't want others to do unto us, doing good to good and justice to evil. Buddha said we should care for all.
Socrates said that rulers must care for the welfare of the people. Aristotle said that equals must be treated equally and unequals unequally in proportion to their inequality.
In the medieval times, Aquinas said justice goes from the higher divine to the lower natural and human realms. In the modern times, John Locke said we must not interfere with liberty.
For Bentham, we must care for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. John Rawls deductively developed an abstract theory according to which justice is fairness.
Chomsky used the principles of justice as the starting point to fight against injustice. In summary, justice meant different things during different historical periods, from the ancient times to medieval, modern, and postmodern times.
So there you have it. 3,000 years of the philosophy of justice in a 1-minute YouTube animation. Pretty impressive, huh? But still, what will the civil justice system or systems in a 21st century global village be? Well, again, I'm not a philosopher, but I do have a thought I'd like to share. In the court, every court in the state of Florida, and I suspect in many of your courts, the following words appear over the head of the judge. We who labor here seek only truth. What if it's as simple as hundreds or even thousands of enclaves of justice that exist to offer dispute resolution in specific corners of the global village, based on a core commitment to the search for truth in that corner of the world? If so, what does that mean for us in this room? Well, I think it presents some pretty fascinating opportunities for us. For example, what if a small group of experienced advocates, like some of you, were to form a virtual international chambers based around a core commitment to offering the highest quality services as both advocates and decision makers to some segment of the world community at large? And what if your primary commitment was to a system of dispute resolution that sought to resolve disputes by searching for the truth above all other goals? What if, patterned after British chambers, the advocates for all parties to the disputes and even the judges who decide those disputes were housed in the same virtual chambers? What if these advocates rejected the need for national licensing and instead looked to international professional organizations for legitimacy in much the same way that the World Wide Web Consortium exists separate from governments and somehow has managed to keep the internet relatively free from most government interference, while it has connected hundreds of millions of people from all over the globe electronically? What if this small group of advocates trained younger advocates and converted those tools that were developed during the last half of the last century in our courtrooms to dispute resolution that might take place partially or even entirely in a virtual world where communication will be dominated by the tools of the newest generation? Here's a test. How many of you know what a meme is? Oh, I knew it. Yep, that's right. I knew the guys in the back would know. A meme is a term created by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. He coined it to describe an idea or a unit of information in the language of genetics. A gene is transferable. It replicates itself, it combines and mutates based on Darwin's theory that the fittest survive. A meme today is an idea that is transferable. It combines and it replicates itself, most often on the internet, according to a similar set of natural rules. If it is a successful meme, it sticks in the minds of those who see and who hear it. It becomes part of the language of the internet. Lolcats is one of the most successful memes on the internet today. It transcends linguistic barriers and cultures. Youth in Russia, China, and the world over know what lolcats are. When they see the cat, they know the cat is saying something ironic and usually funny. It's pretty easy for them to translate using Google Translate or other such tools. From one language to another. So if we want to truly communicate with young people, understanding and learning how to employ tools like memes may well be invaluable. But memes are just one example. Be it instant messaging, Skype, video conferencing, any ideas or tools that are second nature to the internet-savvy generation. There's a world of ideas on the internet that are unknown or underutilized by the legal profession. Let me try to get just a little bit more specific. What if Jim Bostwick, Jack McCoy, Bobby Pacini, Michael Stitt, and some of the other great medical legal trial advocates from all continents decided to form a virtual chambers? Let's call them Medical Legal Advocates Without Borders. And they decided that they're going to provide dispute resolution services to the transnational medical community. You know, I'm sure everybody here knows. There are people who are trying to promote medical travel so that patients from one country will travel to another country where a particular surgical procedure is world-class quality but far less expensive. The absence of a dispute resolution mechanism is restraining the growth of that industry today, because people responsible for paying the bills are reluctant to push patients to a less expensive, more exotic surgical option. Maybe a world-class surgical center in Costa Rica, South Carolina, or India would consider including arbitration provisions in their contracts with foreign patients so that if disputes arise that today cannot be resolved because there is no forum, they could be resolved by the world-class advocates and the world-class judges who make up the virtual chambers of the Medical Legal Advocates Without Borders. Now, this really isn't going to benefit Jim, Bobby, Jack, or Michael, or anybody of their stature and character, but it might become a small enclave of justice committed to the highest quality of justice in one small corner of the 21st century global village, the transnational medical community. Who knows, and I love this one. Maybe a hybrid form of online jury process could be created, calling upon a virtual community to help decide such disputes. And this could be incorporated into an arbitration enclave of justice. Believe it or not, eBay India has experimented with this, and maybe someday we could expand on that experiment, coming full circle to incorporate one of the core commitments that we love about our United States civil justice system, the jury, into an online arbitration process. Now, I admit, some of this may seem like fantasy, and I understand that, but some of it definitely is not. And so before I finish, I'd like to share with you all an experience I had recently. I served as arbitrator in one of those investment treaty arbitration cases I mentioned earlier. It was brought by the Italian owners of marble and granite mines in South Africa. The claim was that the affirmative action mining laws and regulations adopted after the fall of the apartheid regime violated an investment treaty between Italy and South Africa. The claims challenged one of the most important principles based upon which the constitution of this new government was based. I was nominated by the government of South Africa. The arbitrator nominated by the claimants was one of the most prominent international arbitration specialists in the world. He serves as a U.S. arbitrator on the Iran-U.S. Arbitration Claims Tribunal. The chair of the tribunal was an English barrister who's a world-renowned international public law specialist and a professor at Oxford. Yes, I was totally out of my league. The case was fascinating. I'm happy to tell you about it, but my purpose for today is telling you that when we held the final hearings, or the hearings in this case at the Peace Palace in The Hague, the lawyer who argued the case on behalf of the claimants was a barrister who shares chambers with the chairman of our tribunal. That caused you a little concern, right? But you should also know that the lawyer who represented the government of South Africa was responsible for my appointment was that professor of law, Jan Paulsen, who's a friend of mine. Later this month, I'm going to appear as an advocate for a private party, in another one of those treaty cases, so I'll be the lawyer and not an arbitrator, against a government of an Eastern European country. The chairman of the tribunal that I served with in the South Africa case is serving as the chairperson of the three-member arbitral tribunal that I will argue in front of in a couple of weeks. Sounds pretty incestuous, huh? Well, and there's no question, there are lots of people who criticize the international arbitration system as a good old boys club. And I'm certainly not going to pretend that it's perfect. But I will tell you that so far, I've been proud to participate as an advocate in some cases and as an arbitrator in other cases. And although the field continues to be dominated by what a friend painfully calls male, pale, and stale North American European lawyers, that's changing slowly, but it is changing. And not only are younger, more diverse professionals participating, many of the prominent international arbitrators themselves are increasingly moving out of those multinational firms and are beginning to operate in small firm settings or from law school faculties. As I said, next week I will be advocating on behalf of some investors from the United States, and the hearing actually is going to take place in Istanbul. I don't have a clue whether I'll win, but like I think almost all of you in this room, I still love the competition of trial advocacy. And these forums are forcing me to learn new systems and new rules. Most important, they're making me try to adapt the tools I learned from Bill Colson and Bill Hicks to these new forums and to these new decision makers. Like Bill Colson and Bill Hicks, my father and my college speech coach were deeply committed to the value of competition in the adversary process. And I'm grateful for their influence on me. But my father used to say he thought competition is actually the purest form of cooperation. It's always been my favorite example of F. Scott Fitzgerald's famous idea about holding two contradictory thoughts at the same time. But you know, there's another example, and that is when one's able to embrace a revolutionary, innovative approach to problem solving, but at the same time respect and treasure the lasting truths of the past. In the words of Lincoln, to disenthrall oneself from the dogmas of the past, developed for the circumstances of another century, while maintaining those self-evident truths that remain valid and essential to solving problems. In a great passage from the recent movie Lincoln, Daniel Day-Lewis portrays our greatest president engaging in just such an exercise, returning to the wisdom and logic of Euclid to fashion a new dogma for the equality among men that was declared at the founding of our nation, but not endorsed in our Constitution. Here's that scene.
Euclid's first common notion is this: things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. That's a rule of mathematical reasoning. It's true because it works. Has done and always will do. In his book, Euclid says this is self-evident. You see, there it is, even in that 2,000-year-old book of mechanical law. It is a self-evident truth that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
Adapting the role of trial advocates to the massive changes presented by the 21st century global village will require that we rise with the occasion and disenthrall ourselves from the inadequate dogmas of the last century, while at the same time remaining true to the self-evident truths of the greater past. Recognizing one from the other is difficult, confusing, and the need to change can be frightening. More than a decade ago, Jim Bostwick helped us acknowledge that technology is frightening. But most things are less frightening when what has happened before has been wonderful. And in my case, that includes my almost 39 years of marriage with Joanne. She's been incredibly flexible in the face of some pretty ridiculous adventures I thought might help me cope with the massive changes. Although I got to tell you, she did make me go to Mongolia for a week and check out the living quarters before she joined me. Also want to thank our son Kyle. In his 24 years, he's already encountered more personal demons than I have in my 61. And he remains the sweetest human being I know. He introduced me to Sir Kenneth Robinson, and he patiently tried to explain memes to me. I tried to instill some discipline in him, and neither one of us has completely succeeded. But his patience and his help with this speech was invaluable. It was a wonderful way to reconnect after 4 years. And finally, I want to thank all of you for giving me this honor and for listening to me ramble about the future of trial advocacy. Whatever that future does hold, I sure hope I get to continue to share it with all of you. Thank you.
Joe, on behalf of the Academy, we'd like to present you with the Dean's Scroll for that thought-provoking, innovative, creative speech. It was wonderful, Joe. Congratulations to both you and Joanne.